Okay, so the title of my talk today is Hurricanes in the Bahamas, Past, Present, and Future. And what I want to do is kind of give you a brief overview of hurricanes, how they form, but also talk a little bit about our research in some of the coastal ponds. We've been doing a lot of coring, and then kind of segue into sort of some of the societal impacts of hurricanes here in the Bahamas. So these are my collaborators. We have a very interdisciplinary team of researchers from a number of institutions. I'm not advancing here. And this research was part of a NSF grant that I received in 2009, research experience for undergraduates. We were at San Salvador and then Eleuthera for this project. And so these are just some of my collaborators again, and some of the students from our 2013 season. I also want to say that Kjellmark's talk that he presented on Tuesday was also part of this project. And I think the interdisciplinary nature of our team suggests something very important about hurricane research and also conservation research, in that going forward we really have to be as interdisciplinary and interfacing of different types of approaches that we can possibly be, especially in terms of management, mitigation, and adaptation. And the reason why is because Earth is a system, and it's a system that is not just the planet that we live on, obviously, is not just a physical planet, but we as inhabitants are actually geological agents. And so this diagram, I really like this diagram. It's from the IPCC 2014 report, and it shows the linkage between climate change, which includes sea level rise, temperature change, precipitation change, and extreme events like hurricanes, for example, what that linkage is with ecosystems, which we've heard a lot about at this conference so far. But that also includes food security and human health and water resources. And then if we look down here, we're looking at things that are socioeconomic in terms of governance and literacy, equity, population, and trade and technology. And these two boxes here in the corner are really important. They're mitigation and adaptation. On Monday, we attended a climate workshop that was held at the Trust, and it was really an interesting conversation about what to do about climate change in a 1.5 or 2 world, whatever it's going to be, in terms of mitigation and adaptation, because those two elements are what we're really going to have to focus on in the future. And then finally, climate change. So climate process drivers are not just natural now, but they are anthropogenic. So I want us to start thinking about things holistically and as a system, and looking at the interplay between the natural and the human-based system and how it affects us all. So some things I want to focus on here is the human-based impacts of climate, of hurricanes in the Bahamas, the main drivers for hurricanes, what the long-term records of hurricanes are in the Bahamas from paleotempestological studies, and then what effects sea level rise will have on the impact of hurricanes. So how do hurricanes work? Well, hurricanes, if you don't know this is a little bit of a primer. They're cyclonic storms that typically form off the coast of Africa, at least in the Atlantic basin, usually in the highlands of Ethiopia, actually, when the intertropical convergence zone migrates northwards in midsummer, and as the ocean waters are warming and sea surface temperatures are above 80 degrees Fahrenheit, you get low pressure cells, and those develop and move the westerlies across the Atlantic. And as these cyclonic systems develop and gain heat, you can see the cross-section there. The eye forms, and you get these bands of rain and thunderstorms that move upwards. And in the outflow, as this convection cell is building, if you have high wind shear up in the upper atmosphere, like you do in El Niño years, you tend to have breakup of these storm systems. If you don't, then you have higher amounts of higher development of storms. And this diagram or this map shows the composite wind shear for El Niño years versus La Niña years. And so when you have lower wind shears, obviously you'll have more hurricanes versus fewer during El Niño years. So the role of wind shear is really important. So hurricanes are related and linked to El Niño. Looking at the societal impacts, and particularly on small island nations now, we all know that when a hurricane strikes, and it strikes in a heterogeneous manner, in other words, Hurricane Joaquin hit just some islands, not every island, obviously, and so it's very unpredictable sometimes what the pathway is going to be. But when it does strike an island, you have tangible and intangible effects. So you've got direct effects like buildings being destroyed, the vehicles, outbuildings. You have structural damage. You have various issues of cleanup of your debris. You have financial impacts, which are indirect, and you have some, and then you have direct impacts like death, injury, loss of significant cultural items, like Watling's Castle, for example. Part of the wall came down in the last in Joaquin. And then you have inconvenience and disruption in life, and which includes schools, for example. And you've got other sort of societal impacts like stress, depression, and health issues. And so when Joaquin actually hit, it's a late-forming storm, and Mike Savarese is going to talk about this following my talk. But just to briefly describe it here, Joaquin was late-forming, and it formed by Bermuda at the end of September. It ended up striking Acklins, Crooked, Long Island, Rum Cay, and San Salvador. It was estimated to be about $60 million of damage. I'm thinking probably higher now. But if you look at this track, I put this diagram up, this map up on purpose because if you remember, we weren't quite sure where this hurricane was going to strike. And as an anecdote, I was actually on Capitol Hill that day talking to senators and congressmen about the impact of science and science funding, and I was pointing to this hurricane that was going to be potentially striking their states. And I said, this is why we need good science funding in the U.S. so that we can understand these systems that cost billions and billions of dollars. Fortunately, it actually went off to the northeast, as we all know. But the issue here was that the models that were coming out of the U.S., the Hurricane Center in the U.S., were actually tracking towards the northeast Atlantic coast of the U.S., but the European models were actually predicting the actual path. So that was kind of interesting that now our models are not even quite aligned in terms of predictive power. I should mention, too, that this late-forming storm was potentially, and I'm not going to say affirmatively, but potentially impacted by high sea surface temperatures that extended all the way into the fall. So this was the warmest on record in terms, this is the August 2015 data, and shows the warm pool that is right off the coast of North America there. So you can see that that may or may not have caused this storm to be increased in intensity, at least. So looking at specific things on San Salvador, which Mike and I spent parts of January there assessing the damage. The damage on San Sal was not as bad as Long Island, but 80% of the roofs were impacted and damaged. So what does that lead to? That leads to the the building being flooded, people losing furniture, black mold issues. I did talk to one of the people there that had some respiratory issues because she'd been basically having black mold in her house and she couldn't get rid of it. And every time it rained, there was more flooding and more damage to her house structure. It shut down Club Med. It shut down Riding Rock, was severely damaged, the local dive resort. The airport was shut down. The seawall was impacted. Roads were, in some cases, impassable. And then I had been down in July and had seen a lot of work in the parks, the public parks. All that work was pretty much damaged in terms of the structures and the signage and so forth. And that's all very expensive to replace. And then the last item on this list is something that has recently come into the news about Zika. So Zika is correlated, or they're concerned about Zika being promulgated through garbage and pools of small amounts of water. Well, there's no place to remove the debris from the damaged structures, and so they've piled it up close to if you know San Sal, it's sort of south of the airport. There's a big dump now, and we visited that, and there were standing pools of water. So this also brings on lingering effects to the community. Now, if you look at just the hurricane record on San Sal, it seems that a lot of hurricanes hit San Sal. I'm not sure, we're not quite sure if it's the proximity or what, but if you saw Carol Landry's talk earlier in the week, she pointed out that there's been 3 major hurricanes, so Irene, Sandy, and Joaquin in the last 5 years, severe ones. But if you look at this record in the 20s, and some of you might remember these storms, they were fairly significant. They were linked to the same impact as what caused the Dust Bowl. So these storms are very unpredictable again, and at least the recurrence interval in San Sal has been estimated about 2.5 years for a storm. So that's a pretty high rate. And if you're looking at recovery of systems, and if you're looking at resilience of systems, it's a lot to ask a system to recover in that short amount of time. If we look in the Paleorecord, this is a composite of the last 1,200 years of tropical cyclones, all the way up from Boston to, there's a record here from Florida, Puerto Rico, and in the Bahamas. You'll see that during the medieval warm period, which is also coincidence with the Ilyan time, you'll see higher incidence of hurricanes. And we are now seeing the same amount of hurricane activity in our modern era. So the medieval climatic optimum, which is what I'm trying to focus on in my research, had a high amount of hurricane activity. So we call it sort of a hurricane hyperactivity period during Ilyan time. Now, how do we construct these records? We use proxies that we recover from sediment cores. So our most powerful proxy, I would have to say, is a X-ray fluorescent scanning machine, which is pictured up in the left. And we can get down to the micron level in terms of assessing different elements. So we typically scan the cores for bromine, calcium, strontium. We do a bunch of other iron we can do to assess the changes in those elements that have accumulated in the sediments in these lakes. We also have installed dust traps, so we've been able to track the dust in terms of the iron input into these cores. And we've done a lot of assessment of grain size through these cores that I'll show you in a minute. And we've compared them to the beach sands, so we know that when the hurricane overwashes on a dune, it records the storm in terms of a sand layer in these cores. We also use loss and ignition to determine organic matter, and then we use biological proxies like Eric's pollen record and my ostracod record and some mollusks. So this is what it looks like when we take these cores. We go out in the middle of the ponds. Most of them are coastal pond records, and we use piston coring system, and you can see nice layers there of sediment. And then we also have been using GPR. So we've been using shallow geophysics, which my colleague Ilya Buynevich from Temple has been doing dune profiles using the GPR, and we've been able to look at subsurface structures on the dunes. And then my other colleague, Christina Brady, is looking at imbricated boulders that were put in place after Irene. And this actually is on Eleuthera. So I'm going to show you a record on Eleuthera. I know I've been talking about San Salvador, but I'm going to show you a record on Eleuthera because I think this record is probably our best record so far. Those boxes there are our GPR unit transects, and then we did sediment transects as well as coring transects in this lake. This is Shad Pond, if you know Eleuthera, on the southern part of Eleuthera. And what we produce when we do these cores is we produce squiggle plots is what they're called. What they are these measurements down core, and we do an age model based on radiocarbon from terrestrial vegetation that's washed into the lake. And so we have a very good age model for this particular core that you can see on your left. So this is a 2,500-year record. The medieval warm period is located to your left there. The beryllium will tell you salinity. The iron tells you dust flux. The calcium tells you hurricane overwash. The strontium calcium is also a salinity record. And then we do grain size. And if you can see, so that's the calcium record. This is our storm record. And there's actually other time periods where we had storminess. So, and this is approximately 2,000 to 1,200 years ago. And then this is the medieval climatic optimum that I showed you earlier with the Locayan time period located with the blue triangles, showing that during the early and late period there's actually higher amounts of hurricane activity during the Locayan time, which we think is pretty interesting. So with this paleotempestological record, we've been able to create a hurricane recurrence interval that's approximately 0.2 to 0.33%. And then we then can connect this record to the dune emplacement record that we discovered from the GPR transect. So what this red box is showing you is a welded barrier that we think was put in place, that the timing of our core transects was put in place at about 3,900 years before present. It turns out that a lot of the ponds, the coastal ponds in the Bahamas, have this same datum because underneath that 3,900 is a peat layer. And the peat layer is suggesting mangroves, according to Eric's pollen record. So what we think is this cutoff time was due to high storm activity, but also high sea level rise. And then it correlates to our sea level record, which is here. So our sea level record is in the blue boxes. This is overlain on the Toscano-McIntyre record from 2005. And sea level was rising precipitously, and we think that created the welded barrier and the isolation of the lake. So that's important because as sea level rises, hurricane impact is greater, and so this is the prediction of sea level rise and its impact on storm surge, which is Mike is going to talk about in a minute. And that's going to impact coastlines more than anything else, is the rise of sea level and then any kind of storm incursion. And so if you look at this map, it's a NOAA map, shows Category 3 hurricanes and hitting at high tide, and the vulnerability maps. These maps need to be made at high resolution for, in my opinion, all of the Bahamas. So as we move forward, this is my last slide, the impacts of hurricanes going forward, we know what the costs are. They're structural costs. They're also human costs. We also know that hurricanes frequency is related to El Niño, and they're getting potentially higher increased frequency and potentially higher intensity because of climate change. So we know all these things are happening. The question is before us all is how are we going to adapt and how are we going to mitigate if needed. So with that, I'm going to stop and say thank you and take questions.